Normally, when I'm working on a ColdFusion form post, the form data is relatively flat, meaning it's just a series of key value pairs, and there isn't really much complexity to the data structure. But recently, I've been working on a proof of concept in which I need to build up a pending form payload, and that payload has complex aspects to it. So for example, I have a name and an email field here for a contact, but then I might have additional phone numbers, and that can be an arbitrary list of nested structures. So let's just look at this. So let's go Sarah Connor, and this would be Sarah at example.com. And if I submit, what you'll see here on the right is my pending form data structure. And you can see contacts as an array. So now if we add an array item, all these buttons are posting back to the form, and you can see now I have an item inside of this array with type home and an empty phone number. We can add to this. Let's add another one, make this the work one. And we can save, and you can see that as I post back to the server, we're getting those changes in my form mapped over here to the server side pending data structure. And I can set this to be a favorite, and you can see it updates here. We can add a contact, we could remove a contact, and you can see these values are being updated here. And the way this is working is using a sort of object path-based approach to data access. So let's jump into the code to see. It's going to be a little hard to explain this, but let's just see if we can follow along. So here is our test page, and what you'll see is that I'm submitting form.data. And if we jump back over into the browser here and we look at the elements on the page and we look at our form, what you can see is that we have a hidden form field here as the very first element, and we're submitting a serialized version of our data structure. In fact, if we go to our network activity, and let's just clear here, and let's add a contact and look at the network, what we'll be able to see here in our form data is that, again, we're submitting a serialized version of the current state of the form. So this is borrowing from an old ASP.NET approach, which I think is called like auto postback. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm posting the entire state of the form through the form itself. And this way we have a snapshot of the state that we can then act on with each form submission. Let's take a look at some of the other things that are going along with our form. One, we can see an action. We're adding a contact, and that was this button to add this element to the array. So we're adding a contact, but you can see that it's not a simple value. It's add contact : dot contacts. This dot contacts is a key path into the snapshot of our state. So what it's saying is start at the root of our state and go into the dot contacts key, which here is going to be our array of values. Now you'll notice that all of the other form fields use that same sort of dot object path notation. And not only are they using struct keys, but they're using array indices. And this allows me to store values back into a deeply nested array within the state. So we can see, let's go ahead here and add a extension, so x123, and when I submit this, let's look at the submission again. What we can see is that the contacts key within our structure, the first index, and then the phone property of that first index is going to now contain this. And if we look at the state of the snapshot here, what you can see is that there is no extension there. So essentially we're going to take this snapshot and push all of these values into the snapshot, which is going to put x123 as the extension, which we can see here echoed back out in our data dump. So let's take a look at our ColdFusion code to see how this is happening now that we kind of understand what's going on. Actually, let's just look at one more. Let's look at the remove. So this one's empty. Let's remove it. And again, if we look here at the post, what you'll see is that the action is delete contact at the dot contacts key. And then this time we also are providing a metadata for the action, which is the index that we want to act on. So this is saying go to the dot contacts key, which is an array, and then delete the third index. And you'll see in the code that it's not automatic. We're actually doing that, but I just want to show that this action is a kind of compound action, which is the action, the path, and an optional index. Okay, let's jump into the ColdFusion code. So we have our data, that's the serialized payload, and then we're going to put this data into this pending form data. And this is just to provide some helper functions that allow us to get and set data into that complex data structure a little bit more easily. So we're going to pass in the form scope, the key that holds our serialized data, and this is the default structure if that data is empty. And let's take a look at this ColdFusion component. It doesn't hold too much, but we'll step through it here. So again, we're passing in the form scope. We're looking at that data key to see if it's populated. If it's populated, we deserialize it. So again, that's that hidden form field that we're posting through. So we're going to deserialize it, and that becomes the data that we're going to manipulate. And then we're going to loop over the entire form scope, and we're going to look for any key that starts with a dot. So again, looking at the network activity, that's going to be all of these keys that start with dots. This pending form helper is going to say, hey, these are object paths. If that's the case, then let's use it to store these values into the complex data structure. And it's going to call set value, pass in that object path and the form key. So what is set value doing? Set value is going to break apart that dot delimited path, and it's going to traverse down into the deep structure. So let's take a look at set value. So we're passing in our object path, that's a dot delimited path, and the value that we want to store. The way to do this, if you think about what this dot path is, it's really a series of traversal actions. It's saying start at the root, go to the contacts key, then go to the second index within that contacts key array, then go to the type property within that second index within that contacts key array. And if we break that up into dots, then we can reduce down over that series of traversals and step into the object. So we're going to start at the root of our data structure, and then we're going to start reducing down into each segment. And really, all that means is take the current reduction, which is our location within the object, and return access to the current key within that dot delimited path. So that might be a struct key, it might be an array. Both arrays and structs can be accessed using bracket notation, so we can do this pretty uniformly. Now, because we're setting a value, we want to take special handling when the segment index, meaning which value within the dot delimited path are we currently looking at. And if that equals the segment length, then what that means is we've reached the end of our dot delimited path. And at that point, we want to set a value, not return a value. So in that case, we use our current reduction, and we're going to store the value into that segment. So that would be into the phone property or into the email property, as an example. And then getting a value, we can do the same thing. It's using the same exact reduction approach, only this time it's only ever returning. We don't ever have to set, so it gets a little bit easier. So that's what this pending form data is. It's just allowing us to easily access deep properties within our complex and arbitrarily deep data structure. Then we can deal with our action. And our action, remember, is this value, which contains the action we want to perform, the object path on which we want to perform it, and optionally an index. So we can split this apart based on colons, and I'm throwing in spaces there just to make some of the code easier to read. We're going to pick those parts out, the action, the path, and the index, and then all we have to do is look at which action we want to perform, grab that deep value from within our arbitrarily complex nested data structure, and then apply the traditional ColdFusion operation to it. So when we want to add a contact, and let's look at this, let's step through this here. We want to add a contact, and we look at the data. The action is add contact dot contacts. So dot contacts is our object path, which means here we're going to go to our pending form data. We're going to say get value dot contacts. That's going to step into our data structure snapshot, grab the contacts array, and then we're just going to use the native append method for arrays, and we're going to add of type home and empty phone number because the user will then fill it in. Similarly, if we come in here and let's now remove that contact, and we look at this, you can see here the action is delete contact dot contacts 3. So again, that's going to be go to our pending data value, go into the dot contacts object path, get that array, and then delete at, so remove from the array the action index. So that is the third value that was passed in. So that allows us to delete that array. And we're going to set the favorite. We're going to clear the favorite. Again, these are just reaching in and setting values deep within that pending form value. Now, ultimately, this pending form data, if you come down here, you'll see that we have our hidden input field. And all we're going to do is grab the JSON from that pending form data. So with every form submission, we're essentially deserializing that state snapshot, operating on that state snapshot, and then serializing and posting that state snapshot back to the ColdFusion server. And then that allows us to build up this relatively complex data structure without actually having to post any of these values back to the persistence layer. This allows us to build up that pending value iteratively, getting it fleshed out, and then eventually posting it back to the server for data persistence. Of course, I don't actually have any data persistence to this demo. This is just the proof of concept of how to get this done. And anyway, I'm pretty excited about this. I feel like it actually makes this quite easy to do, which would, I think, typically be a very complex thing to do due to the arbitrary nature of the data structure here. So in a perfect world, this would actually be fronted by a rich client, like an Angular client, and I would do all of this data manipulation on the client side. But I'm working on a proof of concept here, and I don't want to get JavaScript involved. I want to just keep it vanilla ColdFusion form postbacks, and I'm pretty excited that this is actually going to make that a fairly easy proof of concept to work on now.